is Totally 80s, the podcast dedicated to the music of the greatest decade ever. So, turn up your Walkman, loosen that scrunchie, and get ready to talk 80s with your host, Lyndsey Parker.
Hi, I'm Lyndsey Parker from Yahoo Entertainment and SiriusXM Volume, and this is another episode of Totally 80s. We love hearing from you, so why not take a second to follow us at Totally 80s on Facebook and Instagram, or email us your comments and show ideas to podcast@totally80s.com. And just a reminder, if you want to see our faces, you can catch this episode on video as well as on our Totally 80s YouTube channel, so please go there and check it out. And joining me today is my partner in all things 80s, the Simon to my Nick, the John to my Roger, John Hughes. There's the extended version I want.
I am excited. I love Rio.
Who doesn't love Rio? And if you didn't love Rio before, if you didn't know much about Rio, if you weren't convinced already that it is one of the most perfect and iconic albums of the 1980s, our special guest today and her book will convince you. She is an award-winning journalist, editor, and critic whose profiles, interviews, and criticism have appeared in Rolling Stone, NPR Music, The Guardian, Salon, Billboard, AV Club, Stereogum, and much more. She wrote the liner notes for the 2016 deluxe edition of REM's Out of Time and contributed an essay to the 2020 Game Theory compilation Across the Barrier of Sound Postscript. And most importantly, for fans of this podcast, her new book on, of course, I think you figured out, Duran Duran's Rio for the 33rd and a third book series was just released. We had her on before. Not surprisingly, we had to go into extra innings. We weren't even past side A. We hadn't even gotten into the serious stuff. So we had to have Annie Zaleski back. It means so much to us, like a pretty view. Part 2 begins now.
Hello. How are you? Thank you for having me again.
Thanks for coming back.
I always love talking about Duran Duran, and it seems like no matter what interview I schedule, it ends up going like 3 hours because I just talk about Duran Duran for hours.
Well, you ready? Let's go.
I'm sure we've all seen Arena multiple times.
The film?
The live.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Live portions. Watch Andy during the live portions. A lot of stuff that you think is Nick twiddling knobs is Andy through effects pedals as well. Maybe additional. But there's a lot of soundscapey things that I think Andy brought that get lost because we're so used to Andy being muscular riffs and everything. But he's also doing some weirdy Nicky things over here too, roadie things.
Well, let's talk about Nick for a second, though, because actually, when we're talking about things that we learned from the book that we thought we should have known, I've always argued that Nick is underrated because he is, the guy who kind of hangs in the back and barely moves, like it looks like a robot alive or whatever, and he's a little more stoic and quiet. I've always said he was the architect of the aesthetic. He's like the most person who represents what you think Duran Duran looks like or is. But I learned from this book how much of an architect he was at the start. He was like, 19 years old, and he was the guy that was putting in the extra hours. Like, I really think this book puts into perspective how instrumental he is in Duran Duran.
I would agree with that. And I think, it really shows off. He's always been the one that loves being in the studio, I think, more than anyone else in the band. And so in this era, especially, he was soaking up everything. I mean, they're at Air Studios. So they're at this, legendary studios in London. And he was really like, okay, I want to make sure the sound is right. Like as you were referencing, they basically he stayed behind to make sure that the mix of Rio was right. With some, whoever the studio people, whoever decided to hang back. And he was like, I don't care. Like, I will miss filming the videos. I need to get this right. And, because he, really him and John started the band, and there was such ownership about it. And when you do listen to this record too, and you listen to all his synth parts too, it is really like, they're all really interesting. And he really is sort of the one that kind of the aesthetic and kind of set it. But yeah, he really, and the way that he talks about, here's how the music came together, and here's in but he didn't like reading manuals. That's the funny thing, is he was just like, I don't like manuals. I'm just going to kind of like play around and see what happens. But he just loved all the gear, and he was very much like, and I think this is very true in the band now. Any new technologies, he's like, yeah, bring it on. Like, let's try this. This is really cool. And so that really, he kind of took to that as well. And so I think that also is reflected in there.
Annie, do you think Colin Thurston gets enough credit?
Not at all. No. And I mean, Colin produced and mixed this record, and sadly he passed away. Was that 2006 or 2009? Yeah, 2006. He worked with Duran Duran on their first two records. And, you know, when you look at other things he worked on in his catalog, he worked with the Human League. He obviously did some stuff with Bowie. He did some stuff with Kajagoogoo, and Talk Talk as well. He was really good at kind of bringing out the best in the musicians. You know, some producers, they have their own style. And when you hear something that's produced by them, you're like, oh, that's definitely a so-and-so production. Colin Thurston was just really good at making sure everybody sounded that like was at the best of their abilities and sounded the best. And, you know, Duran Duran were very much, they knew what they wanted. And so when he was there, he made sure like, let's keep this going. Let's make sure that everyone sounds good. Let's make sure this is mixed good. But no, he was the one that I'm so sad that I wish, you know, I would have loved to have interviewed him. And I looked up to see what kind of interviews there were out there with him. There aren't that many either, which is really sad. And he's like one of those figures that if you're a music nerd and a kind of a liner notes geek, you're like, it's Colin Thurston, because his records sound great. Everything he worked on sounded awesome.
Forever after Rio, whenever a new Duran Duran album would be announced, I like, please Colin Thurston, please Colin Thurston. And no, they never.
Do you know why after Rio they never did again, when Rio was such a game changer for them?
I mean, it might have been that he was busy working with other people, which is very possible, or, you know, that they wanted to try someone new. I don't know, honestly. And I'm not sure. I would probably have to start digging. I'm sure in some interview somewhere it was mentioned. But you figure, you know, back then, like people weren't asking Duran Duran about their music. You know, there was really, let's talk about everything else but your music. You know, the amount of Rio profiles that had very little about their record was like, well, all right. You know,
well,
I don't know if they deserve credit for it or you know, was a missed opportunity, but like in the late 90s, the Lost Wilderness years, Medazzaland, usually bands like this reunite with their original producer, you know, like Human League and Martin Rushnet, you know, U2 and Steve Lillywhite. Why didn't Duran do it when they had the opportunity? It's always confounded me.
But one thing I want to ask you, Annie, is regarding that is when Mark Ronson, who, you know, we could say is pretty instrumental in this whole critical tide that Duran Duran are now experiencing, that ever since All You Need Is Now, when they did that album together, he was, you know, the hottest producer in the game, still is, and was taking every opportunity he had to talk about Duran Duran. He even opened for them, you know, in concert. But I remember him saying something, I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of when he got in the studio with them to make All You Need Is Now, he wanted to make what he thought should have been the follow-up to Rio. He had problems, you know, with Seven the Ragged Tiger, thought it was an imperfect record, thought it was not I don't think he dissed the record, just saying like that should not have been the follow-up to Rio. I would actually say that So Red the Rose by Arcadia is in my opinion, the continuation of the Rio aesthetic. But what do you feel about like how when they got with someone who was such an unabashed fanboy like Mark Ronson, do you feel that album sort of continued or recaptured that Rio sound, that maybe what we would have wanted if they'd reunited with Colin Thurston?
I mean, I think in a sense that they recaptured kind of the real poppy elements of the Rio sound. Like, I think the songs, they're very compact. They get to the point. Like Girl Panic is one of my favorite, like later era Duran Duran songs. You know, the title track is great. So just the idea of let's get in and let's make these short songs like, you know, like you might in the 80s. But I think too, just the way, you know, I think in terms of not overthinking too, I think it's simple. It's a simpler record. They're not going to, you know, Seven of the Ragged Tiger. I think people are like, my God, there's so much going on. You know, everyone, they threw everything but the kitchen sink on that record.
Yeah.
So I think in a sense that, you know, in terms of, because Rio was very simple, you know, they had some overdubs, but like, you know, it wasn't, you know, they had their 24 tracks, but they weren't necessarily, you know, overdoing it. They put little elements in there. And so I think you see a lot of that with All You Need Is Now as well. But, you know, I think it was Roger that told me that, you know what, they're in the studio, they still play very similar to how they did in the Rio era. That they, you know, it's still them when he and John are playing together. It's still that rhythm section that's been playing together for 40 plus years.
Can we talk about John for a moment? I can't believe we're taking this. I mean, when we're talking about the appreciation for Andy's guitar playing, for Nick's synthesizer and production work, I mean, I still don't think John Taylor he definitely gets respect as a bassist now, but I still don't think it's enough. When you were talking about like checking out things on YouTube, there are like isolated bass things on YouTube the Rio one is one of them, the title track, where it's just like, holy cow, this guy should be held in the same esteem with, Flea or, people like that.
100%. I think every time that there's a best bassist list and he's not on it, I
get so mad. Rolling Stone didn't have it, and I'm like, where was Rob Sheffield? Did he call in sick that day?
Exactly.
Because he would have nominated John Taylor.
I would think that he would have clout to make sure he's on that list. Like if I were him, that's what I would have done. Be like, I'm not writing anything unless John Taylor's on this list.
Go on strike, yeah.
No, I mean, it's you almost can't put into words like how like those bass lines on that record, because you're right. When you talk about Rio in particular, he did his bass tutorial and he was breaking down, well, this part is this from this and this part is this. You're like, oh my God, you were like 21 years old. Who was thinking about this? They were so complex, but they were so thoughtful. And, and when you hear it live, especially like New Religion, I think especially is one of them, you're just like, and they're so nimble too. And there's so much velocity. And he'd even used a fretless bass a little bit, and I think part of it was that he did that a little bit, but he wasn't doing kind of all the, the weird 80s bass stuff that kind of really dated the record. He was very much like, I'm going to be a little bit old school. And because they wanted to be a rhythm section, they wanted to be like Chic, they wanted to be like Japan and David Bowie. And so they were very, very old school in that sense. But I can't say enough good things about his bass playing because it's just so good. And it's so influential. I mean, I think he is one of those people that everyone's like, I want to play bass like him. I want to try to figure out these bass lines. And they're very difficult bass lines too. Deceptively, they sound like, oh, sure, this should be pretty easy. And then you try to play them. No way. And that's really a testament to just how, but he was so young too. They practiced so much and he became so good so fast.
This isn't a criticism. He's Bernard Edwards bass player.
That is absolutely not a criticism.
Yeah.
Right. There's a little bit of pop and slap there. There's a different melody happening from the main melody. You hear things like, Last Chance on the Stairway, that where the whole beat changes. Dun, dun. Or no, Lonely Your Nightmare is what I'm thinking of. Lonely Your Nightmare.
Yeah, that song.
And you're like, whoa, all of a sudden this became a very bass heavy song. It's almost like a bass solo at that point. And he is it really shines on something that I can't believe we've gotten this far into it. We have not had this debate yet. The mixes, the different mixes, the original mix versus the David Kirschbaum US mixes, where John's really almost front and center on those remixes for the US. What are your guys' preferences?
Someone has asked me this, and I'm like, I almost like I can't choose. Me. I know. Okay, well, see, I can't.
I mean, I always want more John in my ear, so I'll go with whatever mix had the more that.
It's so funny hearing the Kirschenbaum mixes now, because I think the version of Rio I think I had growing up didn't necessarily have I had like, because as people will know, if you're a fan, there's a million different pressings of Rio, and it's kind of a crapshoot what you're going to actually get. You don't quite know. I'm used to the original.
Columbia House.
What? Oh yeah, I have the Columbia House version. I also have a third pressing that's not the. Yeah, exactly. We could be there for hours.
But why is that? I'm sorry to sound naive. Was that common back then? Because that sounds unusual that there'd be so many different pressing.
Remember how long it took for this album to catch fire. So Capitol was doing everything that they could to make this album a success here, because they saw what was happening overseas. And they're like, if we can get a tenth of that in the world's most populous commercial country, we're going to have some money here.
And, and Capitol was known for doing that too. Thomas Dolby, who released the golden age of wireless, like basically the same week as Rio. There's a million pressings of that record too, because She Blinded Me with Science became a hit, and they were trying to make, the record take off. And so it wasn't necessarily uncommon, but yeah, Duran Duran, especially, there was a second pressing that had a different mix of Hungry Like the Wolf. And then there was a third pressing that the whole first side was remixed, and, trying to figure out, and some of them were on Harvest, and then Capitol took over. So some of them are on Capitol, and it's like, yeah, it's like people will argue. I found there's a message board that has like a 15-year-long argument about pressings, and they still haven't come to any conclusions.
That's crazy.
I think we can all agree, though. Well, maybe not, but most people I talk to agree. The U.S. mix of Hold Back the Rain just completely destroys the original.
Yes.
The difference. The U.S. mix is the longer one.
Yes.
There you go, because we need more, as much Hold Back the Rain as we can get.
I love that song.
I'm surprised that wasn't a single, but to your point, Annie, pretty much they could have thrown a dartboard at the track listing.
They ran up against Seven and the Ragged Tiger.
Exactly.
They knew out. It had taken so long to catch fire here that it was like, all right, we're done with this record.
Well, from what I recall back then in the 80s, it was kind of like just a given that no album other than maybe Thriller had 3 singles. It didn't matter if there were 3 or 4 more potential singles. It wasn't like Alanis Morissette and Jagged Little Pill where it's like, let's put out 7 singles. It was like 3 singles and then on to the next album. It didn't matter. I don't know, maybe either of you have some insight into why that was sort of the business model then.
It was an album a year. There was a cycle. Yep. And when you got the end of that cycle, you had that new album queued up. You wanted to release that first single and give it a couple months to get that new album out there. People forget Save a Prayer was not a hit in the US until 1984 when it was
85. The power station was already like doing stuff. And it's like, oh, Duran Duran's new single. And everyone's like, where have you been for the last 3 years?
Yeah. That's crazy. Well, also, we talked a little bit about Carnival. You mentioned that.
Yeah.
The B-sides from this record, the outtakes, the B-sides, the rarities. I mean, some of the B-sides on this record, again, they could have been singles. They could have been A-sides as well. Let's talk a little bit about Carnival, because if I'm remembering the chronology in your book, Annie, like Carnival kind of like was a hit first, right? On the chart.
Carnival. So, Rio was on the charts, not really doing much, just kind of hanging out, kind of languishing. So in September of 82, they released Carnival. And as we were discussing, there were multiple versions of Carnival around the world. But the US one had Hungry Like the Wolf and Girls on Film, the night versions, which are different from David Kirschenbaum mixes. The night versions are by Colin Thurston. And on the second half was Hold Back the Rain in My Own Way. And they were just called the Carnival remixes. And I believe those were by David Kirschenbaum. And to complicate matters further, a lot of times some of the pressings were mislabeled. So you pretty much had no idea what you had. But yeah, this basically was sort of, so these were all dance mixes, because Duran Duran, there were some radio stations that were doing dance oriented music at the time. And Duran Duran had a lot of success on the dance charts. And so basically there were these extended mixes that different radio stations could play. And that became a success. Like in the fall of 82, that really started picking up on the charts. And it was also cheaper. It was, it was 4 songs. It was an EP. And that finally helped kind of, Hungry Like the Wolf get unstuck. And, and Rio get a little bit unstuck. And so by around Thanksgiving of 82, Hungry Like the Wolf had started picking up at rock radio again. It charted a little bit. Like there was a brief moment where it charted back in the summer, but then finally, it really started to pick up. And then in 83, it crossed over to the pop charts. But it was a journey. It was an epic journey.
What were the B-sides from this record that were actually like B-sides? Like I seem to recall that their cover of Come Up and See Me was Come Up and See Me Make Me Smile, the cover of Steve Harley. That was not a B-side. John, you're shaking your head.
There were no studio B-sides for this record.
Which is weird because there were a whole bunch of good ones for the first album.
Like of Angel was
My Own
Way, which was before. Yeah. So I mean, technically, sure, you want to call it a B-side for Rio. I guess, yeah, that one sneaks in. But Make Me Smile, Come Up and See Me was the B-side from
Snake.
Yeah.
So what was the reason for that? Because the B-sides that were from the first album, like Canada and Late Bar, and I mean, those were amazing B-sides. So like Faster Than Light, that was all first album, wasn't it?
Lack of material?
I think it was probably lack of material, and also because they had so many remixes. I think it like, Hungry Like the Wolf, like all of they had a live version of Careless Memories, and like look out. Yeah, exactly. But then, in America, it was like, well, for, B-sides, which remix do you want? We have like 10 of them you could choose from. And so that's kind of, I think how it led. There was Rio Part 2, which is, it's fine. It's whatever. It's fine. It's kind of forgettable though. If you mention it to people, they're like, what is that? If you're a fan, you remember it, but Actually, until they picked up Seven and the Ragged Tiger, they were like, well, maybe we need to have some awesome B-sides again.
Like Secret October, obviously, is one of the best. But I actually want to pick up on something that Sam Hollander said when he was on the show before, because I want you to know your take on it since you sort of mentioned Rio Part 2. Sam Hollander, obviously, for those people listening who don't know, very successful, hugely successful songwriter. He does a lot of stuff with Panic at the Disco. And he was saying the one thing he didn't like about the song Rio was the do 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 at the end should have gone on longer. He's like, that's such a hook, and they just threw it away. They tacked it on for like 10 seconds at the end of the song, do 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 do, and then it fades out. And he's like, that should have been 30 seconds of the song. That should have been a refrain. That should have been like a pre-chorus. How do you? And I kind of agree with him. It's amazing that they were like so prolific that something so hooky could have been almost an afterthought as the yacht is sailing away, in the video.
It is amazing that they didn't actually do a remixed version of that song that did also tack it on, because that would definitely be obvious. I'm wondering too if that's from a modern lens, like now that sounds really, kind of a modern, like you would think of a Spotify popular single, they might move that around, because there's a weird version of Rio that K-Rock played that had some like TV show like audio. John, are you familiar with this?
No.
There's like, I found it on an air check. It was like this like very famous like song. I'll dig it up after we're talking here about like, it was some like TV show was talking about like drugs or something like that. And there's a version of Rio the DJ played that had that overlaid. And so obviously it was an in-studio mix. It wasn't anything official.
Yeah.
Bizarre though. But yeah, so it's like people kind of did their own thing with how they thought the bridge should kind of go. And so, but yeah, I think that ending is really like totally, and because that gave Simon the chance to really like, do his musical theater. I listen to Rio now, you're like, you can totally hear why, Simon's theatrical side coming out.
I do also want to ask you or bring up a point that I have only actually kind of relatively recently realized. So you were saying, this was a poppy record. When you were talking about All You Need Is Now, it kind of like referenced that sound. And they obviously were a quote unquote boy band, and they were huge MTV stars, and they were on Top 40 radio. And of course, everyone who's a casual fan remembers Hungry Like the Wolf and Rio, which were super poppy. And of course, Hold Back the Rain was too. But like, when you start to really deep dive into this record is not, this is a dark record. Like The Chauffeur, New Religion, Lonely in Your Nightmare. These are not like typical, like happy, shiny pop songs by any stretch of the imagination. There's definitely like a lot of that post-punk, and I don't even want to use the word goth necessarily, but like there's a darkness to it that I don't think people, maybe it's just the image, it's the videos, it's the album cover artwork itself. It was also colorful and tropical, but like this is actually kind of a gloomy record in parts.
I would agree with that. And I think that because exactly what you said, because people saw the videos and they were like, oh, they're a boy band and they look so happy, that there is kind of that moody, artsy edge, when you listen to side 2, especially, and it's very kind of like, had they decided we're going to push that side of the record, and, they would have been seen kind of like The Cure, kind of like, when the Smiths came, just before the Smiths came out, is this like kind of gloomier, artsier band. I was talking to someone today who said their girlfriend saw the video for The Chauffeur for the first time, and her mind was blown. She was like, I had no idea that Duran Duran could be like this. She had no idea that they had that artsy side. And I think that really, in later years, I think they've really kind of stressed like, hey, we do have this side, and people are really recognizing that. But it is dark, and in this record especially. And I think that's another reason why A, it endures, and B, people really gravitated toward it, because it isn't just this like frothy, happy record. There's a lot of introspection, and there's a lot of, there's some darkness, there's some, melancholy to it. And that definitely is there.
It's funny how All You Need Is Now seems to be really tied with Rio in a lot of the conversations. And I think there is a song, The Man Who Owned a Leopard, which is the sequel to The Chauffeur that
stole a leopard. He owned it by devious means.
Yes.
He stole the leopard.
Stole a leopard, exactly. It's the sequel to The Chauffeur that we didn't know we needed. And it really kind of calls back to that sound. And it just shows you, it's my favorite song on Rio, The Chauffeur. Just
mine too.
That song, wow. You hear it and you're like your friend that never heard it before, they're kind of like blown away that it could be a Japan track.
Mark Ronson said it's one of the greatest songs of all time. Not one of the greatest Duran Duran songs of all time. Not one of the greatest 80s songs of all time. He flat out said it's one of the greatest songs of all time. He ain't wrong.
No, I mean, nothing, no other song sounds like that. I mean, that when you listen to it, you're right. It sounds like it could be a Japan song, but just everything about it I mean, what 80s band was having an ocarina on their songs? Do we think of anything? I can't think of one, so. Yeah, right. And so, but so there's that little element. There's like the little samples. There's, the way everything is kind of layered together. It just sounds like it's from another planet. It sounds completely otherworldly. And I mean, I often think of like, what if Duran Duran had decided we're going to lean into this sound going forward?
I was about to ask that. Yeah.
Yeah. The path Huh?
You have Arcadia.
My theory, it holds up. Well, what I wanted to ask you, just not to so much leaning into that sound, but also, we've talked about it here. We've talked about it with Sam. We've talked about it in general. Like they leaned into a certain marketing thing, which obviously worked well for them. They did not, unlike some of their peers, they did not shy away from being in the teen magazines. They played up the fact that they were good looking guys who were into fashion. They made videos that highlighted that, they didn't disavow that. And do you ever wonder, or in the interviews you did with the band or anyone else in their orbit, if they hadn't leaned into that, if they hadn't made those videos, if they hadn't granted the interviews to Tiger Beat or made photos that were clearly designed to be pinups and posters, like, do you think, obviously we have this critical esteem for them now, but do you think they would have, like, how do you think an alternate universe of Duran Duran would have been?
That's a really good question. I should have asked people that, and I didn't. And that's because that's a really interesting thought. I mean, what's weird too is that at first in America, the teen magazines didn't want to cover them. The publicists had to like convince them to try to cover them, even though they were huge in America, in the UK. I mean, had they kept on the kind of the new romantic, it's so funny when you actually look at their progression from like 1981, the very start, to like 1983, and how you can see the outfits and the eras like change just from a visual aspect. You could tell they were trying things out. I think Duran Duran probably would have been a smaller band and probably would have been kind of like one of those really cool 80s alternative bands had they not really leaned into the boy band element. I think because they always had that, hey, we like punk, hey, we like post-punk. I mean, Simon got to see Joy Division and The Cure, like he said on Twitter last year. And I'm like, oh my God, had they leaned into that and, they could have been this cool cult band. They could have made Arcadia and they could have, made a bunch of Arcadia records, which have been okay by me. But I think they would have been kind of a cult band had they not kind of leaned into it. There was so much, the stars aligned so much around the Rio era. Like it really could have gone one of two ways.
I think we have a test case. I think we have one, which is related, and that's Kajagoogoo.
Well, they had a massive top 5 hit though, right out the gate here.
Boy band, pinups. They hated it. They saw themselves as an art jazzy new wave combo centered around Nick Begg's bass playing. Really,
they fired them all. That was one of the greatest mistakes in the history of pop.
And you see what happens. So I think we do have a little petri dish over here where we could see if they had rejected that.
This reminds me, let's get into just a little bit more of alternate universe talk. Have you ever wondered what Duran Duran would have been like if Stephen Duffy had stayed their singer? Stephen Tintin Duffy from Now the Lilac Time and later things.
Kiss Me would have been a hit.
Yeah.
Would have been
oh my God.
It was a hit if you lived in LA and listened to K-Rock at the time, but I mean that when, like, for instance, I have a friend who loves Stephen Duffy's work, loves the Lilac Time, just loves that whole thing. Not the biggest fan of Duran Duran. He's always very amused by the fact that Stephen Duffy was in Duran Duran in the early days before Simon joined. And we've talked about how different that would have, I mean, obviously lyrically it would have been different because we wouldn't have Simon's lyrics, but like Simon's voice is we haven't even really talked about his vocals, like how he has this, I mean, I think sometimes he gets a bad rap for his vocals, but it's like every song is written at the top of his range. And it's like, it's like, I mean, even getting beyond like Rio, when you look at songs like, or getting beyond the Rio album, when you think of songs like A View to a Kill or Wild Boys, it's like really high up there. It would have been such a different band with Stephen Duffy.
I think they would have been a lot more kind of swoony romantic. I think they probably would have leaned into like sounding like Roxy Music a lot more. Cause like, yeah, I mean, Kiss Me is a great song. And he does have such an interesting voice, like a little bit more soulful maybe. but like he, in the Lilac time too, he's a lot lusher, because that music that he made was so kind of lush and like prefab sprout-ish almost. And I always liken it to that. And Duran Duran would have been like, I don't even know where guitars would have fit into that. They would have been like jangly and chiming guitars potentially. Because it would have just been weird. I mean, that's what's so interesting is Simon has such a unique voice, but like, he fits perfectly in Duran Duran, but I don't know if he'd fit anywhere else.
Robert Smith's kind of the same way, even though he does do guest stuff. It's like you hear him, it's him. Sorry, John, go ahead.
Well, back to Stephen Duffy. I think if you take away the Trevor Horn overproduction on it, a song like Icing on the Cake is kind of Duran Duranish. Add a John Taylor bass line to that song, and you've got Duran at their roxiest, or Stephen Duffy at his Roxy music-ish. So roxiest, is that a good adjective?
It is now. I like it.
It's not Duran Duran without Simon. I think we've discovered what the chemistry truly is. And I love every single thing about that guy. I love the hiccups, I love the yelps, I love the voice crack at Live Aid. The man can do no wrong.
He's drama. It's all about the drama with him. Nothing subtle about him. And actually, I would say his voice, like I said, sometimes he gets a bad rap for singing not being technically perfect. But I think in recent years, his voice is the best it's ever been. I know he had some health scare. He had to have surgery on his voice. He had, he'd have basically his vocal cords repaired. And I don't know if he did any kind of, voice therapy or training with a vocal coach or whatever. But I feel like he rebuilt his voice. And when you hear him do these old songs, the Rio songs or whatever in concert, they sound better than they ever have live vocally.
I would completely agree. Yeah. I mean, I've seen them, many times over the years on different tours. And, and that was one of my biggest takeaways. I saw them last in 2019, was like, gee, Simon sounded amazing. They did the chauffeur at the show I saw. So he puts on the hat and he comes out, but it sounded so good. It just, I think you're right. And I think everybody has really, they've always been great musicians, but I think just because they've been playing together so long, they still sound so good live. Everyone sounds like there's a little bit of extra every time I see them.
Extra.
Speaking of live and things that are happening as things are opening up, and I know it's not Rio, but since I've got two fellow Duranis here, I have to ask, what do you think about Graham Coxon being in Duran Duran?
I am for it. It's Bluran.
Yes.
Or you could call it D-U-R. I prefer Bluran. I mean, that's definitely a combination I didn't see coming, but, to put two, iconic bands together from two different eras I love, it works. I mean, at the time we're recording this, they've recently debuted that lineup, on the Billboard Music Awards. And I don't know how many times Graham is going to perform with them, but he seemed like a full-time member. And he's like apparently all over the album Future Past that's coming out. I thought it was just going to be one or two tracks, but he's like all over it.
My Blur fandom made a lot more sense when I found out that he was playing with Duran Duran. I was like, oh, like some like synapses started connecting because I love them.
Girls and Boys is a Rio track.
I know.
It kind of is. Someone needs to do a remix, like a mashup, of like Girls and Boys and Girls on Film. Actually, that's what we have with this album. That's actually a good way to sort of bring it into the future past, as you will. You mentioned the Killers, Annie, and I've mentioned Interpol, and we, just mentioned Blur. But like when you talk about the influence that Rio in particular has on the modern crop of bands, are there any other bands that that maybe you interviewed or talked to or just anecdotally know really owe a debt to this record?
I mean, I think the most interesting thing is that when I really started digging into, I'm like, oh, because I looked for people to interview, like who's influenced by Rio. I found so many people. From going back to, the members of, Jonathan Davis of Korn is a huge fan. Found members of Linkin Park. I mean, obviously, if you're a 90s kid, Courtney Love loves them and, Billy Corgan and, modern parlance. I think what's so interesting is that with Rio, no one has ever duplicated that. People try. I think the Killers probably came closest, but there's no real band that's ever captured what Duran Duran on Rio sounded like. There's kind of echoes of it a little bit. I saw there's a couple things here and there, but no one has ever come close, and I think even like Roger Taylor said, he's like, no one sounds like us. And it's true. Whatever they did on this record, that magical alchemy, like no one can really kind of duplicate it.
Absolutely.
That's a funny point because you think of other bands of that era and you can name a bunch of clones like
Yep.
Depeche Mode, okay, Camouflage,
Yeah.
The Cure. You can name a ton, but you can't really name a Duran Duran cloney band.
No.
Kaja Gugu maybe, and only really because of the fact that they were very closely associated with Duran Duran due to Nick Rhodes' production. But yeah, I will say I do want to just share one anecdote of a comment I had. I got to tell David Cook this, which made me very happy. So David Cook won American Idol in season 7. He is the only guy to have ever covered Duran Duran on American Idol. He did "Hungry Like the Wolf" in like the year you were born week because he was born in '82.
I'm gonna go kill myself now.
No, he did it. And so, it's the only time on The Voice they've covered Ordinary World a lot, but they never go back to Rio. And that could be some licensing issue with those songs not being cleared, or it could just be that a lot of people don't want to do these songs because they can't make them their own. But David Cook did "Hungry Like the Wolf," and he's the only guy to have done that. So shortly after that, it was when "All You Need Is Now" came out, because David Cook won in 2008. I was interviewing Duran Duran. I was interviewing John and Roger, and somehow that came up, but American Idol somehow came up. And I mentioned this fact to Roger, and Roger goes, "And I do believe he won American Idol, didn't he?" I'm like, "Yep, it's all related. It's because of you guys." But I thought it was amusing that he knew that, but he was like, and he won. And I got to tell David Cook that, and he was very honored. He's like, he didn't realize that he was the only guy who'd ever covered Duran Duran Idol, but he was very honored that the guys in Duran Duran were aware of that, and and gave him a little bit of like cheeky props. So the tentacles go out there.
I want to say I didn't want to kill myself because he covered Duran Duran. I wanted to kill myself because it was songs the year you were born week.
Don't watch American Idol now, where it's like songs the year you were born, and they're covering songs from like 2003. You'll feel even worse. But actually, David did a nice job of it. But yeah, there aren't too many. That would actually be a good thing to bring up before we end, is aside from the influence, not too many people actually cover these songs. There was a tribute album to Duran Duran, but like a lot of people don't cover Duran Duran songs. Do you think it's because this magic, this alchemy you're talking about, especially on Rio, is just like, it's just too hard to cover a Duran Duran song? I know Courtney Love did "Hungry Like the Wolf," actually.
Yes.
Deftones did "The Chauffeur."
Okay. Yeah. They actually did an amazing job of it, I will say.
No, I would agree with that. No, I think it is a degree of difficulty, and I think it's interesting because you see that I've seen some kids like on ukulele cover Rio. And so they kind of strip it down to like the very, like the bones of it. But like the full band fleshed out version, there's a reason why I think that people like try metal versions of like "Hungry Like the Wolf," because you can kind of make it your own, because you can't replicate the sound. People try and it just does not work. I think it is degree of difficulty, and just, I think people also like putting their own spin on it, just because the songs are so much fun to play. You can kind of play around with it too. When people do cover them, they try to do something a little bit different with it. So I think that's a testament too.
That's the challenge, is you want to do something different, but then you realize you can't
improve on perfection.
You can't leave out the bass line of Rio.
Yeah.
You change it. You can't do Rio without the sax solo. And so basically karaoke at a point.
Yeah.
So so basically the point is that you can't improve upon perfection. And this was a perfect album, as you say in the book, Annie. The book that I'm holding in my hot little hand, the 33 1/3 Rio book. What would you like? I mean, obviously we took such a deep dive into this long conversation today, but for people reading the book, particularly people who maybe weren't super educated about this album or Duran Duran before, what would you want their main takeaway to be?
One of my biggest hopes, I guess, is that if people are sort of like, I know Duran Duran, a couple songs, I want people to really respect the band as musicians and respect the band's songwriting, and really kind of, throw out their expectations. Like if they thought Duran Duran was one thing, or they only were like, oh, they're pretty, there's nothing else to them. I hope that they kind of see, that they're wonderful musicians, and that there's a lot to the band, and that they really are kind of deserve to be seen as one of the great British bands of no matter what era, kind of the, we talked about in the book that they came out of the era where Bowie and Pink Floyd and, the Clash and all the Sex Pistols were all these amazing, amazing British bands. And, Duran Duran are definitely from that tradition. And I hope people see that a little bit more too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for doing the Lord's work. Thank you for your service. Thank you for seeing this to fruition over a 14-year journey to get this book made. The book is the 33 and a third book on Rio, available now on Amazon and physical bookstores, which are open again. Thank you so much, Annie Zaleski. I am Lyndsey Parker. I've been joined today by the Nick to my John Hughes. And we want to thank you for listening. Remember to give us a rate and review on your favorite podcast platform, and we will catch you next time.
This was Totally 80s, the podcast dedicated to the music of the greatest decade ever. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Totally 80s, and please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Until our next episode, catch you on the flip side.